Many ecological economists now argue that not only do we need to move beyond the pursuit of economic growth in wealthy nations, we now need degrowth to achieve environmental sustainability and social equity. In this video, I've decided to do something a bit different and have interviewed Giorgos Kallis, who is one of the leading researchers on degrowth. Giorgos is an ICREA professor at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, where he teaches ecological economics and political ecology. He is the author of 4 books on degrowth and over 100 academic articles. In this interview, I ask him what is degrowth and how do we achieve it. So thank you, Giorgos, for taking the time to participate in this video, which will be the first interview that I've done in this series of lectures. Your recent book is called The Case for Degrowth. So I thought I might start by asking you, what is the case for degrowth?
The case for degrowth is the argument that we need to abandon the ideology of the constant pursuit of economic growth as something that is good, desirable, necessary, and natural. It's none of these things. And if we really want to stay within limits, planetary limits that make sense, we need to change and transform economy and the way we organize our lives.
So how do we do that? What is degrowth? What would that entail?
Degrowth entails a number of transformations at different levels. In the book, we start by arguing that the change has to start from us people living in current growth economies and societies, capitalist societies. And it's about small everyday changes where we come together and produce and consume differently. Producing and consuming in common. We emphasize the idea of commons. But just by doing things differently within the current political and economic system, not much will change. So we articulate that in combination and in interrelation with political changes that have to take place at a higher level.
So one of the things that I find quite interesting in the literature, and I know you've written this and other people have written this, is that degrowth is not less of the same, but building something different. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit on that? Because I think when many people hear the term degrowth, they probably just think, well, that's a reduction in GDP, that's a recession. But I know that's not what you and other degrowth researchers mean by degrowth.
Yeah, I mean, shrinking the current system, the current capitalist system, and making a smaller capitalist system is not the idea of the growth. The idea is that we have to change basic institutions and we have to change the ways we live our everyday lives and we interact. So we're talking about a bigger transformation here. We're talking about increasing the activities where we share time, we share production, we share consumption. It is about transforming the infrastructures, our transport infrastructures, our energy infrastructures, the way we produce and the way we consume. And it's about changing the stories we tell about ourselves. And one of the bigger stories we tell about ourselves is that we personally, as a nation and as communities, we have to constantly strive to grow. That's a story that has to go away.
So why wouldn't we just have, let's call it selective degrowth? So in the degrowth literature, it's sort of argued we need to downscale production and consumption, which many people might object to and say, well, that's going to crash the economic system. Why wouldn't we just downscale the bad stuff like fossil fuels and upscale the good stuff like renewable energy?
Yeah, I mean, of course we should do that. And no matter what we do, if we are serious about avoiding disastrous climate change, we have to upscale renewable energy. But what we are saying is that we can't do that in a spirit and in a context and in an objective which is of constant economic growth. Because with constant economic growth, even with renewable energies, 3% more growth of the economy every year, we're going to have an economy that is 10, 12 times bigger by the end of the century. So it has to change. Not only we have to change how we produce energy, but we have to change also the objective and the overall structure of the economy for which we are producing renewable energy. So our argument there is, yes, of course, some sectors will have to be upscaled and will have to increase, but that doesn't mean an overall increase of the GDP, and it doesn't mean growth as we understand it right now, which is more and more whatever.
So if we don't measure degrowth with GDP, how might we measure it?
Yeah, one question is like, why do we need to measure everything? But if we were to if we were
Fair enough.
if we were to measure it, yes, I think we can measure it with ecological and social indicators, planetary and social well-being. That's what we are after.
So, Yorgos, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the policy changes that would be needed to achieve degrowth. One of the assignments I give my students each year is to write a policy brief on various different ideas that might help achieve a sustainable economy. So, I'd be quite curious on some of the ideas which are developed in your new book, The Case for Degrowth, on the changes that would be needed to actually achieve degrowth.
In the book, we have 5 policies, among many others, among tens of other policies that we might want to include there, but we have 5. The first one is a Green New Deal without growth, so a Green New Deal that will be paid without needing to have a constant expansion of the economy. The second is universal care income, which is a universal basic income, but with a philosophy and a direction of compensating for the unpaid care work that it's the foundation of the real economy, and without which there is no economy to begin with. We see this, the universal care income, alongside the universal basic services, like providing services at an affordable cost, basic services at an affordable cost for everyone. The third proposal is reducing working hours and work sharing. And the
My
fourth one,
personal favorite.
yes, and mine.
In theory, at least. Yeah.
Yes, we have to start practicing it. But I think, I mean, I'll go back to that, but I think this precisely is we would like to work less hours, but within the current system is difficult. So this is exactly why we articulate that with a need to organize to get politically the concessions and the institutional and changes that would let us do things that many of us would like to do right now. The fourth one is a support for solidarity economy and for commons, for new commons, cooperatives, new type of activities that they are emerging right now. They are incipient and they need the support of the financing of the state to be strengthened. And the last one is changing the tax system. Instead of taxing labor, taxing resource use and carbon emissions, and using the revenue from this taxation to pay for the necessary changes or to redistribute to people as a dividend and reduce inequalities. We also support the idea of Thomas Piketty and other economists for a considerable wealth and estate tax.
So it sounds to me like many of these proposals would require quite a strong role for the state, a fair amount of state intervention. And I just wonder how you kind of square that with the idea that degrowth is also seen as a bottom-up kind of activist movement as well. And in some of the literature, it seems to be described in that way. So I'm just curious, what role do you see for the state in degrowth?
Yeah, we have an article with Giacomo D'Alisa, The State and Degrowth, published just before the book, and it's a more detailed explanation of how we see it, which is the view that permeates our book, and it's based on a theory of political change drawing from the Italian intellectual Antonio Gramsci. So we don't think that this distinction between bottom-up and top-down is useful. Instead, we try to think of the culture, the civil society, where culture changes and changes through practical everyday changes, so the way we do things every day, and the way we think about things changes at the level of civil society, and then of changes that have to take place at the realm of political society,
So
the realm of coercion.
what sort of changes do you mean?
I mean, if I start buying my things and putting my time in a food cooperative and doing this every day instead of going to a chain supermarket, that's a change that takes place every day. No, it's a change that I embody. I do it day in, day out. And it's also a change that if more and more people do it, their common sense about how things work changes. No? So then when we talk about cooperatives or we talk about the commons, it's not just an abstract idea that some academic throws while you go and buy your things at Lidl, no? But it's something that starts making sense to you. Now, if we stay at that level, it doesn't make any difference. But the idea is that if it starts making sense for you to do your things in a cooperative manner, then you want also the political structures and the political parties or the ruling, what Gramsci calls the political society that has the power of coercion, to enable these forms that for you are your everyday way of doing things and what makes sense to you.
Okay.
So there you need to organize politically to get the institutional changes that are necessary for the things you're doing. So then you need, for example, a municipal authority that supports cooperatives rather than putting laws that make it impossible for a cooperative to survive and compete with a corporation. So that's the double movement we see there for transformative change. So it's not state versus grassroots. I mean, these two things go together. We cannot do without the state in our complex societies that we have right now.
Would you say then that degrowth is fundamentally political?
Yeah, of course, everything is political. I don't think there's anything that is not
Including
political.
including mainstream economics. Economics surely is not political. It's value-free.
Yeah, economics is exactly. It's David Harvey has said that the most ideological position is that there is no ideology, you know, and that's precisely what's economics. It's the most political thing is that precisely that they claim that they're not political.
Okay, so to shift gears a little bit here, how would you see the ideas of degrowth aligning with the ideas of ecological economics in ideas such as sustainable scale, fair distribution, efficient allocation, and so on?
I think the growth is an evolution of these ideas, is the next step, because ecological economics was, at least part of it was developed as an offshoot of mainstream economics, a reaction to mainstream economics. So it still maintained some of the legacy of mainstream economics, which was a feeling that the posture that you describe the world from the outside and you just know what is proper to do, and then you deposit it down there, and like some enlightened policymakers will do that, no? So you explain to them that they need to put a sustainable scale, they will understand it, and then they will put a sustainable scale. Degrowth instead, I think, is a more developed in that sense political economic take that understands that the fact that policymakers do not do that and will not do that unless there is a social change that will make it happen, right. You know, it is because you have to understand how the capitalist system works, how politics, what's the role of the state within the capitalist system, why growth has become such a big idea over time, how growth is linked to capitalism and colonialism. So you need a bigger perspective to understand how the good sense ideas of ecological economics can be put into practice. So I think it's a much fuller view of the transformation that we need.
So where do you think then that capitalism fits into this? Is it possible to achieve environmental sustainability under a capitalist system, or is something different required?
I think something different is required. It's definitely built in the capitalism. Built-in capitalism is the constant quest for expansion. A system that doesn't increase accumulation and doesn't increase profits year after year. I mean, we can call it as we want, but it's not going to be capitalism. So that it's not going to be capitalism doesn't mean that we're not going to buy things, that there's not going to be money around, or that there's not going to be forms of private property. So all this is up for discussion. And of course, it's not just for discussion, it's for how things evolve. But if we understand capitalism as a system that you make more money and you invest it to make more money, this obviously is in contradiction with the fundamental idea of ecological economics, which is limits.
So speaking of fundamental ideas of ecological economics, perhaps one of these is Herman Daly's idea of a steady state economy. So I'm curious on how you see the idea of degrowth and the idea of a steady state economy fitting together or not fitting together in various different senses.
I think it's more or less what I said before. So I like Herman Daly's idea of steady state economy. I studied it. I mean, this is part of my own formation. I find he has strong ideas, and he has also strong policy ideas of how things can change. I think what it lacks is more awareness of why a steady state economy is not going to happen anytime soon unless there is a serious social transformation. And how, like,
political ecology perspective that
yeah, the political economy, political ecology perspective. I think that's what's missed. And as I said, the principle of sustainable scale, redistribution and equality, etc. Yes, these are the principles, but we have to understand why these principles are not respected right now and what sort of changes can bring us closer to these principles.
So the issue of population growth is another one which Daly tackles and incorporates to some degree into the definition of a steady state economy. But that's an issue which degrowth is perhaps more ambivalent to. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, one cannot argue that there's going to be compound growth in population, and that's fine, and we're going to have 50 billion people after a few years, I know that there are people now in the US, progressives arguing for 1 billion people in the US as a progressive goal. This obviously is wrong, and I don't think it's a novelty to say that, no, and to say that the growth cannot be based on policies that they want to increase population, etc., etc. But the question again is to understand why under capitalism there is a constant quest for increasing population, and when population doesn't increase, for allowing the immigration of cheap labor, undocumented labor, so that the machine can keep going. So we have to understand what's the source of population growth and population inflows, which is the need of capital to have cheap exploitable workers with minimum rights, and point the figure there rather than point the figure to mothers in Africa who happen to have many children right now because they are caught in particular economic circumstances where it makes sense to have more children. So again, what I don't like in Herman Daly's approach is that he focuses on population as the category itself, that needs to be tackled. And then it's like Herman Daly doesn't do that, but many other people with problematic ideas will do that. They will focus on Africa where population growth is higher, and they would focus on interventions on controlling women, which are horrible. I mean, they're horrible ideas. So precisely degrowth does not want to be part of that. We want to understand the systemic forces that lead to population growth, and we want to change these ones.
So what about the global south then? So degrowth is usually cast as a proposal which is necessary to reduce production and consumption in wealthy nations. But does that mean that the global south then continues to pursue the goal of economic growth, or should there be a different development model, and how does that fit in with degrowth?
I mean, we talk about the places where we are from. I think one thing that we don't want to repeat, it's the standard colonial mentality of neoclassical or mainstream economists, who they think they know everything and they fly with a plane around the world and they go and tell countries what to do now. So that's not the idea here. The idea is that I know that in Spain right now, or in the US, or the countries that I know and that I've lived, they need degrowth. So let's start from there, I don't want to tell what people in countries that I haven't set my foot in should be talking about. Now, the second thing is that I understand that the ideology of growth and the practice of growth is linked with colonialism and exploitation of other parts of the world. So I think if we stop doing that, it's going to be better for the rest of the world. It's also a colonial idea. I mean, if you trace the history of economic growth and economic development, it goes hand in hand with the evolution of after the colonies got independence, is the way the West found to export its own ideology and model and control indirectly the rest of the world, like created these leagues where we are supposed to be on top and they are below us, and then they have to become like us. And we are the ones who are going to help them and tell them how to become like us. So degrowth wants an end to all that crap, So let's finish with this, and then let's see what different countries in different parts of the world come up with and how they develop and fulfill their potentials.
Last year, you published a book called Limits: Why Malthus Was Wrong and Why Environmentalists Should Care. And in the book, you argue that limits and scarcity are not the same thing. I was wondering if you could maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, limits in mainstream economics, scarcity is a fundamental idea, and it's the idea that what we want has no limits. Therefore, the external world is by definition limited to satisfy everything that we want. That's the eternal condition of scarcity.
Very sort of neoclassical idea of unlimited wants, Homo economicus.
Yes, the assumption that individuals want as much as possible, as much utility as possible, and they want to maximize it. And economics is the science of this maximization or optimization. No? This idea can be traced back to Malthus, actually, who was the first one who came up with this, one among the first ones, not the first one, but one among the first ones who came with this.
So Malthus was a neoclassical economist? Is that what you're saying?
Malthus was the first, I mean, he wasn't neoclassical because neoclassical came after, but he was the first professional economist. So of course the whole discipline has evolved after him. We can discuss separately why then they chose to portray themselves as being different from Malthus, but they're not at all, because
really
Malthus, yeah, Malthus was the first one to assume that we want to have children without limits, like have as many children as possible with geometric growth, which was a strange idea because people around him and people in previous civilizations were controlling how many children they had. I mean, I read a lot about ancient Greece, and most of the families you read about had 2 or 3 children. I don't remember any 10 children families. So obviously they were aware of that, no? That you can have the children that you like, that you want, and that you can afford, and you're not gonna just
or maybe they just didn't write about the other ones. They only wrote about the children they liked.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe they were the important, the 2 ones. The other ones ended up in some mountain. No, I don't think so. I think they were having family planning policies, as all civilizations have. And when you see situations where there are many more children, it's precisely because the economic and ecological conditions have changed, and it makes more sense to have more children. But that's not something that humans have not thought of or desire, and they're going to have as many children as possible. But that's the assumption of economists, that left to our own devices, we want as much as possible of everything, and then the world around us is by definition limited. There is scarcity. So what can we do? We can be disciplined and produce a little bit more each year to satisfy these unlimited wants. Instead, I argue that the ecological position is the precise opposite, which is our wants are not unlimited. And actually, we need to limit our wants if we are to live satisfied and fulfilled life. We need to have a limited amount of children.
So it's about sort of choosing limits, about self-limitation, as opposed to externally imposed limits upon us. Is that what you're saying, or?
Yes, precisely. But that doesn't mean that there aren't external conditions that they are not of our own choosing. But I think that the relationship is dialectical. So you can have an external condition and then choose that you're going to confront it and try to overcome it in order to satisfy the supposed unlimited wants. Or you can choose to adapt to the conditions, and you can choose to set limits so that you can have a meaningful life. I strongly believe that a meaningful life is a life within limits. Life without limits loses its sense.
Another idea, which I found quite interesting in one of your previous books, is the idea of dépense, which I think is perhaps an idea that many environmentalists might struggle to wrap their heads around. So I was wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit about what dépense is.
Yeah, that's a complex one. I'm still trying to read the 3-volume book of Georges Bataille, and it's a hard read. Let's say it's not easy, but the basic.
So 30 seconds or less, then.
30 seconds or less, impossible. But the point is that we derive pleasure when we can, as sovereigns, spend our time and resources in things that they don't have a utility. Because when we spend things with a utility, with an aftermind of thinking, oh, it's about the future, it's because if I invest now in my education, I'm going to be winning more money in the future, or if I do this deed, then this is going to be better in the future. We treat ourselves, we become things, we become means to an end. The idea is that what really makes us feel human and where we find ourselves is precisely where we do things that they are the end themselves. When, for example, we go out with friends and we have a nice party and fiesta and we drink and we lose ourselves for a night, and we don't think about tomorrow, and we don't do it in order to. That's the dépense, and that's precisely the moment where we are sovereign. We are sovereign because we don't treat ourselves as a means to an end. We are the end. And there are many activities that actually we express our sovereignty, from festivals to parties, to philosophizing without any reason late at night for hours and hours. And these are actually the things that give meaning and pleasure in our life.
And recording YouTube videos, of course, that's very, very high on that scale. So why is this important to degrowth? What does this have to do with degrowth?
It is important because capitalism and growth are based on the precise opposite, which is like all the extra spent resources that we might have, all the extra time we're going to have, we have to invest it in something that's going to produce more tomorrow. That's the motor of growth. If instead this surplus that we might have, we spend it in order to just stay idle in our houses and and laugh our guts out, or if we just spend it in a nice carnival, then the whole machine of accumulating and producing more and more breaks down. This is a little bit of a mind shift for ecologists, because ecologists are also thinking, oh, we have to be frugal, we have to save here and save there. But they have to understand that this saving is essential for capitalism.
So there's a slightly funny idea here, isn't there, though, that if by sort of enjoying the present more, and perhaps by being more mindful in the present, we are then not using those resources for the future accumulation of built capital. We're squandering them now effectively, but then we're not building up built capital, which is then going to lead to a higher resource flow in the future. So in a sense, by being more mindful of the present, we're protecting the future, perhaps.
Yes, and of course the counter argument there will be, right now we live in a climate disaster and we have to be mindful of the future, and we can't just spend fossil fuels to have huge concerts with AC/DC, you know. So yes, if we get down to the practicalities, of course, it's not about not thinking about the future, but it's a realization that first of all, it's an analytical thing to understand that where societies make meaning is what they do with the surplus. You know, and capitalist civilizations invest the surplus to make more surplus in the future. Other civilizations use it to build pyramids. You might say it's good or not. But if we want to think of a different ecological society, we have to think of what we do with our surplus. And I think a degrowth, a hypothetical degrowth society should spend its surplus in a way that provides pleasure and sovereignty to all of us, but in a way that it's not discounting and destroying the future.
So speaking of the future, do you think it's possible to have a smooth degrowth transition, or is that not a possibility? Is some kind of revolution or some sort of collapse necessary in order to really achieve degrowth?
I think a little bit of everything. I think right now staying within 2 degrees Celsius of climate change seems more harder and harder, but there is always struggles happening and there are always fights. And this will only intensify as the impacts of climate change become more and more visible. The impacts of climate change, I think, are going to derail economies. It might be late then to reverse some of the changes. We're going to scramble, as we've always done as humanity. There's going to be suffering and loss, but there's going to be also moments of pleasure and moments of creativity. So I think there's nothing special about degrowth in that sense.
Okay. I'd like to finish by asking you, what do you think the biggest challenge is for degrowth, and what makes you most hopeful about degrowth?
The biggest challenge is to get over, let's say, misunderstandings about what it is, and to have convincing proposals of how we can manage without growth, given that these proposals have not been tested. And if they are tested, they're going to be tested in difficult situations, right? So they're going to be tested in situations where societies are just grappling around with a economic recession or sort of collapse. So they're not going to be.
Though in some cases, things like working time reduction have been tested. The universal basic income pilot projects are out there. So it's not like none of these ideas have been tested anywhere, but certainly the confluence of all these ideas together, I don't think has been tested.
Yes, but they have been tested in conditions of growth. So how do you test them in conditions of where you don't have growth? Is the
Well, we have the coronavirus crisis right now.
Yes, we have it, and I think it's a good example, because like right now many things are tried, out of the playbook, and many more could be tried out of the playbook. And I think this is how we have to think about the growth. But the problem is that when you try them in situations like that, no one is going to be fond of the corona period, no?
So there might be an association between some of the policies which are necessary for degrowth and the times when they have been tried, which may be during recession or during some other crisis.
Yes, that's one thing, and the other is they're going to be tried in difficult conditions. So it's not going to be easy also to sustain them or how they're going to work. So it's going to be a mess, and this, I think, is the main challenge. You asked me for the challenge. So I'm saying honestly here, what I think is a challenge, that it's not going to be like a nice, smooth situation where a Swedish social democrat, very Dennis, applies a nice set of degrowth proposals, and everyone is happy and goes with their bicycle. No?
So what then makes you most hopeful about degrowth?
What makes me hopeful is that I think there are people, and there have always been people to which it makes sense, and there are people to which it makes sense that a meaningful life is a life lived within limits. And these people are everywhere, and they are radicals or they are not radicals. There are people ranging from Pope Francis right now to a lady that lives in my neighborhood and is working class, and it's like likes the way she has lived all her life in her neighborhood, and of course is pissed with the government, and is pissed with companies that they're not paying their fair due, the people who don't pay their taxes, also doesn't want to change their life and buy a yacht, you know. So these people are everywhere and all around us, and I think these people will keep giving me hope that different worlds are possible.
Well, that sounds like a good place to me to end on. Thank you very much, Giorgos.
Thank you, Dan.
Participating in this interview. It's very much appreciated.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
So, when did you first meet Osama bin Laden?